Hi ladies and gentlemen, this is Ms. Skokin. We're going to start lesson 4.2, and in case you're looking for this in your textbook, it begins on page 269. You can use the page indicator in the lower left-hand corner of the screen when you go into your Vital Source textbook. Let's touch base first on our learning targets. Explain the concept of confounding and how it limits the ability to make cause and effect conclusions. Distinguish between an observational study and an experiment, and identify the explanatory and response variables in each type of study. And last of all, for this lesson, identify the experimental units and treatments in an experiment. As a reminder, we have a ton of new vocabulary. It is very important for us to understand the distinction between terms and also have a very strong working vocabulary with statistics so that when you see these terms in questions, you know exactly what it's referring to and how to respond. Lesson 4.2, Day 1. Does SAT prep improve scores? Last year, North Broward High School offered an after-school SAT prep class that students could volunteer to take. 44 students took the course and then took the SAT. The average SAT score for this group was 1220. The average SAT score for all students who did not take the prep class was 1050. Okay, so that's the setup for this lesson. As always, I want you to try to answer the questions 1 through 5 on your own. And then when you turn the video back on, we're going to go over those answers together. So have a read through of all of the questions and jot down some notes, your responses to the best of your ability right now. And we'll meet back in just a couple of minutes. Question number 1 reads, is the situation described an observational study or an experiment? And we know that it's an observational study because no students are required to take the course. The difference between an observational study and an experiment is in an experiment, the treatment is imposed. In an observational study, there is no treatment imposed. Number 2 reads, identify the explanatory variable and the response variable. And we know that the explanatory variable is whether or not they took the prep class. So we can call it prep class status if we want to. And the response variable is the resulting SAT score. Remember that we choose the explanatory variable so that it can be used to help predict the outcome or the response. Number 3 asks, can you conclude that taking the SAT prep course will cause a student's SAT score to increase? Why or why not? And you may remember in the previous chapter, we talked about correlation is not causation. So just because we see trends in behavior doesn't mean that the change in one variable causes the change in the other variable. So we have to be very, very cautious about that. And in order for us to conclude that causation has occurred, we have to run an experiment. Question number 4 asks, identify as many other possible variables that you can that may explain why the SAT score are higher for those who took the prep course than for those who did not. So your list and my list might be completely different, but we just want to think of different ideas of other things, other factors that could be at play here, where it's not specifically taking the SAT course that makes the scores higher, or not taking the SAT course makes the scores lower. So you can review some of these, and again, you may have different ones on your list, but we call these confounding variables because their presence makes it unclear as to whether or not the explanatory variable actually had any kind of an impact on the response variable. Number 5 says, design an experiment that would allow us to determine if the SAT prep class causes an increase in SAT scores. Be as thorough as possible. So we start out by randomly choosing 100 juniors to be part of the experiment. The 100 juniors are going to be our experimental units. That's the terminology for the subjects of the experiment. Next, we would randomly split the juniors into 2 groups of 50. Then one group would be assigned to take the course and the other group would not take the prep class. And this is the treatment and the control. After the prep class is over, all juniors take the SAT and we compare the average scores of the two groups. That means we compare the response variable results. You can see that we've included a lot of new vocabulary here, so let's get to the next page where we're going to fill out our box of important ideas. There are two major ways that we can collect data. The first one is called an observational study. And an observational study is where we collect data by observing but not imposing any treatment. The other big way that we can collect data is to run an experiment. What's important to remember about experiments is treatments are imposed and it allows us to establish causation. When we run experiments, we have explanatory variables and response variables. Explanatory variables are used to predict, and sometimes in an experiment we have more than one explanatory variable. If that is the case, we call them factors. And sometimes the factors can have multiple levels. You may remember this example that we talked about before, but if we were running an experiment on how to best cook chocolate chip cookies, we could have two different factors, one of them being the temperature that we used in the oven, the other one being the amount of time used to cook the cookies. And the different levels for the time could be 10 minutes and 12 minutes. And the different levels for the temperature could be 325 degrees and 350 degrees. That would make for a total of 4 treatments because it's 4 different combinations of 2 factors, each having 2 levels. The explanatory variables are used to predict the outcomes in the response variable. And at the end of an experiment, we're always comparing what the response variable outcomes are. What makes an experiment is that we impose treatments. So remember, the treatment is what is being done to the participants or the subjects of the experiment. And the participants of the experiment are known as the experimental units. And one of the things we need to be on the lookout for is the presence of confounding variables. Those are variables that can be in the background affecting the outcome of the response variable, but that are not the explanatory variable. So something else, some other variable that is having an impact on the response variable. So this is probably one of the chapters that has the most vocabulary between all of the different types of sampling that take place and all these different elements of an experiment. We've still got a lot more vocabulary to come in future lessons, but that summarizes what this lesson is all about, and that brings us to our check your understanding question. So just as a reminder, you're going to be working on these and then check your answers in the posted notes online under the chapter 4 resources, and I will see you back in class.